Shabbat Shalom and Moadim L'Simcha. When Israel was being founded again in the modern times, the early periods of the different waves of immigration that we call aliyot, they had many challenges. But none was more pressing than the reestablishment of the language of our people as a language for our people. That is to say, Hebrew being reintroduced as a conversational vernacular. And no problem was more critical in the reestablishing of Hebrew as a normal conversational language than figuring out how we could swear at each other. Because it turns out most of biblical and rabbinic Hebrew doesn't have a lot of swears. It's funny that people did not preserve those throughout our texts throughout most of the centuries. And so many of the early immigrants would use swears that came from Yiddish or from German or from Russian or any of the other languages that were there, and many were adopted from Arabic as well. But I think this shows that they were not looking hard enough, because there are indeed many derogatory terms, maybe not swears so much, but definitely derogatory terms used in classical Hebrew. And well, we're going to work our way up to the one I don't think you know, but let's see if we can start with some you might already know. So if you called someone an Amalekite, what would you be calling them? What's that? A terrorist. You'd be saying you're somebody out for blood. You're the Amalekites, like the ones that attacked us. Remember, Haman descended from. Right? Terrible guy. You're an enemy of our people. You should be obliterated. Likewise, if you called someone a rodef, a pursuer, you would be referencing a part of Jewish law that says if somebody is in the act of pursuing another person to kill them, you are allowed to stop the pursuer even before they have committed their crime in order to save the life of the person. Unfortunately, this term is primarily used by people who are exceptionally nationalistic, and indeed this is the language that was used to justify the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. So not one to be casually brought around. One that might be more familiar to others is the word mamzer, which means bastard, but not quite. Because English, that term actually has a legal definition, and it is not the same legal definition as the Jewish definition. And in English definition, a bastard is somebody who was born outside of wedlock, period. Whether it was through an adulterous affair or whether it was just two young people doing something stupid and leading to a child. Whereas in Hebrew, that last case would not create a mamzer. It's only from a forbidden relationship, whether it be adultery or incest. So it is a slur on one's parentage. It's a slur on one's appropriateness. Likewise is the term that is probably not familiar. Well, we're going to find out of how well you've read your Tanakh, to call someone a Gibeonite. To call someone a Gibeonite. I thought I'd hit nothing there. Okay, so who were the Gibeonites? Well, if you've read your book of Joshua, you'd know this. But unfortunately, despite including it in numerous Haftarot, the book of Joshua does not get enough press. I don't take it personally, even though I share the name. I understand that when we finish the Torah, we sort of just go into a mode of reviewing the Torah rather than moving on through the rest of the Tanakh. But in the book of Joshua, numerous things happen. It is, of course, primarily involved with the settling of the land of Israel. Our people had been absent for multiple generations because of the famine and then the enslavement in Egypt. And so that meant that we needed now to return to the land of Israel, and the Canaanites that lived there were none too happy with the idea of our people coming home. And so at the point in the story that we'll focus on, we had already had to fight a battle of Jericho, that you probably remember, and we'd also fought the battle of Ai. Maybe not so familiar, but another one of our major struggles to establish ourselves in the face of these Canaanite city-states. Well, the Gibeonites were another group living in the land. They were another Canaanite group. And they weren't dummies. They saw what had happened to Jericho. They saw what had happened to Ai. And they're like, they're coming for us eventually. And we need to find a way to get past this. So what did they do? Well, like I said, they were no dummies. They all got together and they all left. Now, Don't get me wrong, they're not just leaving the country, although that was always an option. Instead, what they did is they went out, they dirtied up their clothes and wore them down. They made sure that all of their bread and other provisions were the oldest ones they could possibly find, so that they were stale and crusty. And they took their bottles, the skins for their water, and they bent them and broke them and made sure they looked like they were worn out, and their sandals were the tattiest ones they could ever get. And then they made a U-turn and came back to the camp of the Israelites. And they looked like they'd just been traveling for 1,000 miles. And they show up in the camp of the Israelites, and they're like, "Who are you?" And they said, "Well, we heard about the miracles that your God had done for you. We've heard about how amazing you are, and we want to sign up." And the Joshua and the elders said, "But you're not from around here, right?" And they went, "Oh, no. Oh, of course not. We've been hiking forever. I mean, look at our shoes. Look at our food. Of course we're not from around here." And Joshua and the elders went, "Well, okay then. Come on board. It's nice to have people that are passionate about what we are trying to achieve, and you are welcome to join us." And after a few days, they couldn't quite keep up the act. And it was revealed that the Gibeonites were like from 2 hills over, and that they had faked their wanderings in order to fool the nation of Israel. So now the question becomes, what do we do with them? Right? They lied. This was a whole costume and an act and lie and deceit, and we made a promise to them. What do we do? Well, if it were you, what would you do? You'd kill them. Exactly. We're going to come back to that attitude a little bit later, because I'll give you a little bit of a foretaste. The term Gibeonite as a slur has nothing to do with their deception. You might be thinking, "Oh, Gibeonite, it's a trickster." Nope, that is not what the term Gibeonite is referring to at all. We'll come back to eventually how we use it as a derogatory term. But how would you handle it? Kill them because they lied? I mean, after all, they are Canaanites. They've deceived. They came under false pretenses. Sure, we offered them peace, but if we'd known who they were, we would have had to wage war against them or expel them from the land at the very least. No. Joshua said, "Look, we swore to God that we would offer them, that we were at peace with them. We swore to God that they could be with us." And to go back on that would make us terrible. We would be violating what we hold dear. Even though they deceived us, we will not do that. And so the Gibeonites were allowed to stay. They were allowed to stay and be among the people, but their status was always a little fluid, shall we say. And in fact, in Jewish law and halakha, it is a wonderful tangle of different elements that are either the same or different depending if you are from the Gibeonite group. It was used as a very interesting foil throughout rabbinic legal definitions, the technicalities of which we will not be going into this morning. Instead, we're going to skip ahead 500 years, because the Tanakh likes to do that, and now we are in the days of King David. And again, I will refer you to the Tanakh, and if you have not read these stories, boy, you're missing out. Because during King David's time, when he had gotten most of his own personal act together, there were still a number of crises that were taking place within the kingdom. And one of them, at one time, was a famine. These things happen. But of course, when there is a famine, you need to resolve it. And because at the time it was considered that this was likely a punishment for some national fault, he went to the Kohanim. And the Kohanim used the Urim and Tumim, the prophetic stones that were part of the ephod, the breastpiece of the Kohen Gadol, to find out what had been done wrong. What was the problem that was leading to this famine? And lo and behold, the problem was that King Saul, the previous king, the one before David, who tried to kill David, but that's another story, had oppressed the Gibeonites. They're still there. 500 years later, they're still there. And they were being oppressed by King Saul. So, what do? You go to the Gibeonite community. And you say, Gibeonites, we know that Saul was oppressing you, and God is angry enough with us at his oppression of you that the nation is plunged into famine. So we need to fix this. We need to resolve this. We have to make amends. So tell us, Gibeonites, what can we do to make this better? And the Gibeonites say, well, Saul oppressed us and he murdered many of our people. We'd like to murder some of his kids. We want to murder some of his kids. That'll make things fair. I'm sorry, what? Wait, what did you say? I thought I heard someone else in the group earlier say that they would kill people. Well, yeah, welcome to Team Gibeonite, right? He wronged us, so we want to kill some of his kids. Now, Saul was already dead at this point, and so were some of his children, but there were still some living. And they indeed set out and killed many of his remaining children. They were adults at the time. Don't think they're killing babies, but they probably would have at the time. Now, the story's not over there. Right? I love bringing these stories and making everybody go, what, this is in the Bible? Yes, this is in the Bible. Right? The story's not over there because King David is so appalled by their behavior that he makes an edict that from now on the Gibeonites are no longer considered to be part of the Jewish people. From this point forward, we are separate destinies, because that is not the way Jewish people behave. Jewish people are marked by mercy. They are marked by kindness. They are marked by humility and meekness. They don't murder the children of their enemy as a form of vengeance. What is that? You guys have been with us for a while, and yes, we were upset about you tricking in your way in, but this is beyond the pale. And so says our tradition, the term Gibeonite becomes a derogatory term. Rambam himself, in the book of Mishnah Torah, where he lays out Jewish law in exquisite detail, says that if there is a Jewish person and they show hatred, they show anger and meanness, if they lack kindness, you should suspect that maybe they have some Gibeonite in their ancestry. Somewhere in their family tree, there's a Gibeonite hanging out, whispering for blood. Because that's not what Jews are like. Jews aren't like that. So personally, I would love to reintroduce the term Gibeonite into our lexicon. I'd love if we had a derogatory term for somebody who was unkind. Because that's not normally the way it works, of course, because those that are on the side of kindness usually aren't using derogatory terms because, well, they're nice. That's the point. But we should reflect, even if we're not going to adopt this term into our common parlance. We should reflect on what Rambam was trying to say 1,000 years ago, about what had been done 1,500 years ago, with people who had entered into our nation 2,000 years ago. Sorry, lost track. 1,500 years before Rambam, and 2,500 years before that, 3,000 some years ago. That throughout this entire thread, the thing that bothered our people the most wasn't their duplicity, it wasn't their deception, it wasn't that they were pretending to be in need and tricked their way into our country. None of that was a problem. I mean, it wasn't a great honor, but it wasn't a problem. They were welcomed in, and we continued to honor the peace that we had offered to them, up to and only breaking it when they were revealing themselves to still 500 years among us, being desirous of blood vengeance against the offspring of somebody who had wronged them. That was not acceptable. That became a byword in our tradition. That became a stigma. And our teachings from throughout our history are unanimous on this. There is no one saying, let's hunt down and kill the children of our enemies. There is no one saying, when those who come knocking at the door, check to make sure they're not Gibeonites. We build our courtyard so that the poor can be heard. We stand at the border so that we can greet those who are running, as we talked about on Pesach night, whether it be Moabites or anyone else. We offer shelter to those that are foreigners running into our land trying to escape those that have enslaved them. Judaism has a consistent, unanimous, uninterrupted message of how we treat others. And it's easy to pass it off in the language of the Seder and in the language of Torah. You were strangers, and so you understand the soul of the stranger. But that is rare. The Gibeonites didn't get that message. The Gibeonites were still old school. And that is the more common ideology around the world, even to this day. Where it's not a matter of, if I was oppressed, I will learn not to oppress. But instead, if I was oppressed, I will learn that it's terrible to be oppressed, but it's pretty good to be the oppressor. Because I saw all the benefits that my oppressor got by how they treated me. So what I really want is not only to be out from under their heel, but to have my boot on someone else's neck and gain those benefits for myself. It is revolutionary in Judaism, by divine decree, that is not what we are meant to learn. That we are instead meant to do the opposite of what most of humanity has done throughout most of our human history. That we are meant to take our own suffering and not see it as an excuse to inflict suffering on others, not to see it as an excuse to close the doors to others that are in need of help, but to instead see it as a constant moral call, a bell ringing within us daily, that is not the correct response. That God, as our God, has commanded us to keep those doors open, to ensure that we do not become like the Gibeonites, that we don't become like the Canaanites, the Amalekites, and the others whose immorality led to their own self-destruction. And their lack of kindness became a byword for a wretched person. The status of refugees and of immigrants is one that causes a lot of confusion for many, many groups. Those that are consumed in their own patriotism sometimes have a hard time understanding how they can be patriotic to their nation while still allowing others to join. It's tricky for them. I understand, it's hard, but it should not be hard for us. Because we have 3,000 years worth of lessons teaching us that this is what God has asked. And whether you feel it yet in your bones that you are driven to kindness for those in need, that the definition of us is always constantly expandable and able to include more than you thought yesterday, whether you feel that yet or not, you were commanded. Just as surely as you were commanded to eat matzah, just as surely as you were commanded not to murder, you were commanded to love the stranger. You were commanded to offer help to all of those in need. And our tradition has shown our people doing their best to do that and condemning us from within when we fail. This is not a new idea. This is not something that's been invented in the 20th or 21st century by some wishy-washy liberal rabbis. We are talking about King David. We're talking about Joshua and Moshe Rabbeinu. We're talking about Rambam and all of our tradition in the meantime. If you take Judaism seriously, you must take seriously the plight of those who are strangers, those who are refugees, and those who are in need of immigrating. If you take your Judaism seriously, this is at the core of our story, and it is a story the world desperately needs to hear. And with that, we will look to a little bit of history from the English world. If you'll turn to your handout, that's this one that you got coming in, not the one with the Torah readings, but the portrait page. From the book of Sir Thomas More, a play that was not exactly in great popularity in the classic Elizabethan scene. This passage was written by William Shakespeare. He didn't write the whole play, but he contributed this part of a speech by Sir Thomas More. Now, the setting is during the riots that were taking place in London against immigrants. The argument was these immigrants were taking our jobs. These immigrants aren't like us. These immigrants aren't part of the great Britishness. Now, he could have argued from history that being Anglo-Saxon should already tell you that you are a composite people, being Anglo and Saxon, two different groups that were from the continent before they had settled and displaced the native Celts and Picts of the British Isles, and who were then later uprooted and pushed around by both Vikings as well as Normans, which was a different species of Viking. But being Shakespeare, he wasn't going to rest merely on historical arguments. He wanted to point out the underlying human argument. And for this, we should be eternally grateful. And if you'll join together with me, or if you'd like to just read along, that is entirely up to you. So Thomas More addresses the mob that has come together to try and force the expulsion of these immigrants. And he says, grant them removed. Imagine we've gotten rid of all the immigrants. And grant that this your noise hath chid down all the majesty of England. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs, their poor luggage, plodding to the ports and coasts for transportation. And that you sit as kings in your desires, authority quite silent by your brawl. And in rough of your opinions clothed, what had you got? I'll tell you. You had taught how insolence and strong hand should prevail, how order should be quelled, and by this pattern not one of you should live an aged man. For other ruffians, as their fancies wrought, with self-same hand, self-reasons, and self-right, would shark on you, and men like ravenous fishes would feed on one another. Oh, desperate as you are, wash your foul minds with tears, and those same hands that you, like rebels, lift against the peace, lift up for peace, and your unreverent knees make them your feet to kneel to be forgiven. You'll put down the strangers, kill them, cut their throats, possess their houses, and lead the majesty of law in line to slip him like a hound. Say now that the king should so much come too short of your great trespass, but to banish you. Whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbor? Go you to France or Flanders, to any German province, to Spain or Portugal? Nay, anywhere that not adheres to England, why you must need be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarism that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford you an abode on earth, yet whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs, and like as if that God owed not nor made not you, nor that the elements were not at all appropriate to your comforts, but chartered unto them? What would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case, and this your mountainish inhumanity. Shabbat Shalom.